Have you ever wondered what might have been going through Mary's mind, what her thoughts and feelings were as she went through her 9 months of pregnancy and then gave birth and held this child for the first time? What would she have been thinking about the future of this child? She was given woefully little to go on. If we simply go on what we're told in the Gospels, she was simply said that she would become pregnant, come with child through the work of the Holy Spirit, and this child would be the Messiah, would be the one who would save his people. She was not told how this would happen. She was not told anything about that, what his life would be like. And what about Joseph? He's often the forgotten person in the Christmas story, the one that is lost in the background. Really has very little, if we do our Christmas plays, he never has much to say or anything to do at all, except for be there. What would have been going through his mind? Why me? I'm just a carpenter. Why her? She's just an ordinary girl. We lit the Bethlehem candle today, which represents faith, but it says something else. It says that God works through the insignificant and the small and the ones that the world would discard and not say as having any particular significant part to play in his work. And that's who he chooses to often work through. Well, as I reflected on this sermon, I was reflecting on what Mary and Joseph would have been thinking and what they would have been going through. It actually took me back to kind of when my two kids were born. Now, both my children are adopted, so we like to say they weren't expected, they were selected. And, because of that, we weren't present right at the birth. In fact, Jonathan came to us as a foster child. And we were told that this child had been born, this baby had been born, had some serious medical issues, probably would not live long enough to be released from the hospital, but they needed somebody to put down as possible home that he would go to on an interim basis while they looked for a permanent home, because his birth mother had already signed over the papers for adoption. So I met him when he was 10 days old. Now I got to say, I know babies are supposed to be cute, and you're supposed to say all little babies are really cute. He was really quite homely. He was born with two growths in the heart wall. He was given to seizures, and so he would often have all he saw was the whites of his eyes, and he was shaved because they had to keep doing tests on him. And now he was Irish Italian, so I always said, you're always at war with yourself, Jonathan, because those two parts don't get along too well, even in the world today. And his ears he looked like a little Irish leprechaun. And I remember holding him there, and this is honestly one of my first thoughts. I said, this kid's got a face that only a mother would love. I was not thinking that we were going to be the father and the mother in the longer term, which we became. Had somebody told me what his life was going to turn out to be, honestly, I'm not too sure I would have taken it on. I'm not too sure about that. But he became very special to us as well, and we've told the story before. Then there was Jessica. Jessica, I always told Jessica, she's my graduation present, because she was born my last semester in seminary. And I said, and by the way, kind of as I was getting ready to graduate and did all the interviews and tried to look for work, nobody was hiring, and I thought, I guess I'll go back to driving bus. And I remember thinking, at the very least, if all I do is I go back to driving bus and this doesn't come to anything, I got a precious little baby daughter. Now, I met Jessica the day after her birth. Diana was actually there the day she was born. I got to hold her shortly after her birth. But I got there the day after. And while Diana was spending time with her birth mom, I walked the corridors of the Plains Hospital in Regina. Had a long conversation about what her life should be like, and how she should watch out for guys. And you can see her eyes wide open. She just stared. She was a day old, okay? She just stared at me the whole time. It was actually a little bit uncanny, a little bit unnerving as well. But what about you? I know there's parents here, and maybe grandparents, and even uncles and aunts. When you held your baby or that baby for the first time, what were your thoughts? What was going through your mind and your feelings? Were you thinking about how their life was going to unfold? Where they were going to be? What they were going to do? All the dreams and hopes that you had for them. Natural things to do. The reality is we have no idea how that life is going to turn out. And most often life does not turn out the way we had planned or even the way we had hoped. And that's been Diana's and my experience all the way through. But our kids have taught us a lot, and we've grown a lot through that. But Isaiah, in the text that we read earlier, he was looking into the future. He was given this word of prophecy. He was looking beyond his present situation and wanting to offer words of hope to a people who needed that kind of hope. I really doubt whether he fully understood. In fact, I'm pretty sure he did not fully understood the full significance of the prophecy that he was given, nor how it was going to all be fulfilled. See, these were very desperate times in the life history of Israel. The kingdom had been divided for pretty close to a little over 2 centuries by now. So about 200 years Israel had split into the kingdom of the north, which was Israel, and 10 tribes had gone that way, and then 2 tribes were part of the kingdom of the south, which was known as the kingdom of Judah. There had been all kinds of kings that have come and gone, and particularly the kings of Israel, for the most part, when you read through them in the book of Kings and the book of Chronicles, one of the most common statements that it says about them is that they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Kings of Judah didn't fare a whole lot better. And throughout those 2 centuries, and especially kind of increasingly, there was a religious and political corruption going on in the country. There was abuse of position and power, so much so that it was the times were characterized by social injustice, taking advantage of the poor and the vulnerable. But on top of that, there was a looming international crisis because the nation of Assyria, which was the power broker of the day, the international power broker of the day, was looming on the border of Judah. Probably at the time of this prophecy was given, had probably already conquered and taken Israel, the northern kingdom, off into captivity. And now was threatening Judah. Isaiah pictures these times, describes them at the end of chapter 8. He talks about the people in Jerusalem as distressed and hungry. He says, they roam through the land, and when they are famished, they will become enraged, and looking upward will curse their king and their God. Isn't it characteristic of human beings to curse those in authority, to curse God, to blame somebody else for their situation than looking at themselves? He says, and then they will look toward the earth and see only distress and darkness and fearful gloom, and they will be thrust into utter darkness. It was what described the situation. And can you imagine Isaiah walking through the streets of Jerusalem with all of this taking place around them? People were needing some kind of words of hope. And instead, Isaiah was saying to them, you've kind of made this, and we are now going to be paying the consequences of these things. But then he moves into what we have now as chapter 9. Now, in our Bibles, and I've said this before, we have chapters and verses that kind of break up the flow. But you really need to read the chapter 9 immediately following chapter 8, because that's Isaiah's continuing on with the same train of thought, addressing the same circumstances. And I want you to put yourself in his situation and the situation of the people where all this stuff is going, like darkness and distress and anxiety and all these things characterize their time. Isaiah's walking through the streets, and in this he goes on to say, nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who were in distress. He's using the same words here that he had just described their situation before and said, the gloom and the distress that you are experiencing right now will be no more eventually. Now, these words at different times are translated in different ways, and they could be as easily translated into the present tense, and he could say, there is no more gloom. He could be saying, there is no more gloom for those who are in distress. See, for Isaiah, his prediction was more of a fact than simply a future thing. It was as good as done. For Isaiah, this was what he could see through the eyes of faith. I have a quote from one commentator, J. Alec Mosier, who says, the eye of faith looks at all this but affirms that, real though it is not the real reality. As always, the people of God must decide what reading of their experiences they will live by. Are they to look at the darkness, the hopelessness, the dreams shattered, and conclude that God has forgotten them? That was very much what the people were saying. God has abandoned us. Or are they to recall his past mercies, to remember his present promises, and make great affirmations of faith? So just for a few moments here, what about you? What is God's nevertheless into your life? What reading of your experiences are you caught up in right now? Are you caught up in reading the experiences from the immediate present, from everything? And perhaps life is good for you right now, and that's great. But I suspect for some right now, life is not so good. How are you seeing that? Are you seeing that through the eyes of faith, that here is God's nevertheless, this will not be forever? See, for Isaiah, hope is a present reality, both part of the now and a continuation of the now. In other words, one is going to flow into the other. The way he states that his words could be translated as either in the present or in the future, and challenge the framework, our way of thinking of life and how God works. Isaiah goes on to say, the people walking, that means living, the people who are living in this darkness have seen or will see a great light. And on those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. He goes on to say to the God, you have enlarged the nation as you've increased your people and increased their joy. Again, you need to put yourself back in the people who are hearing this for the first time. They were not experiencing any kind of joy. They're still experiencing that. When we live in a broken world, and that's what we live in, we live with the consequences not only of our own brokenness, but the brokenness of others. The innocent suffer along with the guilty. It's part of being a community. Is that when things go wrong just because of decisions that are made by some, those who would not have agreed with those decisions, those who would not follow along, those who were wanting to live life the way it is supposed to be lived, they still experience the same darkness, the same distress, the same issues, the same problems that those who brought it on. The people walking in darkness, that means all of them living in darkness. The ones who are living with eyes of faith experience joy because they can see beyond today. See, both hope and faith, they're the flip sides of the same coin, and it takes both to move ahead. Both hope and faith take our focus off our present situation and our circumstances and shift our focus onto God, who he is and what he is like. Now listen, it's easy to have hope and to have faith and to have those appear and to come together in the church on a Sunday morning. It's a whole different matter, isn't it, when you are out in the world where you work and things aren't going right. And people challenge your faith, challenge life itself, challenges what it is. It's easy to trust in God when things are going according to plan, when life is unfolding as you think it should. But what happens when everything begins falling apart? When everything around us starts falling apart, and often not because anything we have done, not because any fault of our own. The people walking in darkness, that included both the faithful as well as those who were causing the breakdown in their nation. But Isaiah goes on to give us 3 reasons why they, in that time, could experience joy in spite of what the circumstances that they were involved in. And that's what the rest of this is about. I want to take a look at. If we read on to verse 4, the first reason he says, he says, for as in the day of Midian's defeat, and he's calling them to think back to how God has worked in the past. And he specifically chooses not any great kind of escapade like the Exodus or anything. He chooses to refer to Gideon. Remember Gideon? Gideon was at a time when the Midianites were intimidating Israel, and they outnumbered them both in arms and in people. And they were threatening to invade. Gideon's threshing his wheat in a winepress. In others, he's trying to hide. And the angel Lord comes to his, "Oh, mighty one." Hardly what described Gideon. And here Isaiah reminds him in the time of Midian's defeat at the hands of Gideon, when he raised an army, a small army, went out. He says, "You have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressors." He says, here's the first reason to experience the joy is that God will give you freedom from oppression. He will set you free from he sets captives free. That was part of Jesus' call to ministry when he stood up. He said, "I have come to set captives free, to free people from oppression." The second reason he gives is, he says, every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled out in blood will be destined for the burning, will be fuel for the fire. We can lose some of the implication that is here, because usually when you defeated another army in battle, you took their weapons, their equipment, and you repurposed it for your own use. And when he refers to the warrior's boot, he's referring to repurposing. He's referring to an item that they would have repurposed. But he says, instead, we're going to burn it all up. We're going to put it away. What he's saying here in between the lines, when you see in between the lines, he says, when God acts, he's going to put an end to war. You will no longer need any equipment. At the end of Isaiah's prophecy in his book, he talks about weapons being turned into plows and into farming equipment, because the world will no longer need them because at war. Our world's greatest economic powers, their greatest source of financial gain in their economy is from the production of weapons. And it's ironic because they produce weapons to sell to their enemies so that they can go to war. The economy of some countries would collapse if we would end up with world peace. There's no need for the weapons that they think of. All the ships, the destroyers out there, the aircraft carriers. Think of all the jets. Think of all the bombs and all that would no longer need to be produced. Isaiah is looking to a time when there will be no more war. There will be peace in the world. And these first 2 reasons that he gives them for rejoicing, he's talking about what God will do. And then he says, here's how. For to us a child is born, a son is given. And again, I want you to put yourself back in that situation. We sometimes are so familiar with these words and we see them when they actually become fulfilled, we understand them, that we fail to understand the impact it would have had on the people then. I can imagine somebody thinking, remember how we described the situation, somebody saying, a child? Like, what good is a child going to do us? How long will we have to wait for that child to grow up and to be mature enough and learn enough to actually lead the country? We need somebody to come and help us now. We need a Savior now. We need somebody to rescue us now. Don't we think that way often? We want God to work in the immediate present. God's timeline is often not ours. He says to us, a child is born, a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. Remember, before he talks about the oppressors, the burdens on their shoulders. And now they're burdened down, and here he's saying, this child will take the responsibility for the government. It will be on his shoulders. And then he goes on to say, and he will be called. And he begins to describe who this child will be. Wonderful Counselor. He's not just a good counselor. Kings always had their advisors. And when he has that word counselor, he's talking about the advisors. Our political leaders have their advisors who may be good and may not be so good, often are not. He's saying this child will have the government on his shoulders and he will not need human counsel because he himself will have the wisdom to know what to do. And the word wonderful there is not just wow. It's not awe and amazement. It has a sense of being supernatural, of being divine, of having this supernatural wisdom that will give him an understanding of what needs to be done and when all the time. He will be called Wonderful Counselor. The adjectives here are as important as the noun. Mighty God. It's hard to know exactly what Isaiah understood from the very words that he was speaking. Because he was a prophet and he spoke the words as God gave him words to speak. Mighty God. That would have impacted people and been incomprehensible for him that this child would be called Mighty God. It would not enter their realm of perception or perspective that they could make sense that a child born could be God himself. Yet it would seem that from the construction of the words that Isaiah has, that is exactly what it means, although we don't know whether Isaiah understood fully the significance of what he was saying. Do we understand that significance? God comes to us as a child. Times when I have some quiet times and late at night, especially on Christmas time, and I reflect on Mary, and I'm thinking, this defies my ability to understand that God, the creator of all that is, we live on this little speck of dust that we call planet Earth that goes around a very insignificant star that we call the sun. That exists, and as our solar system exists in the backwaters of a galaxy that we call the Milky Way, a galaxy that has literally billions of stars in it as well, that is really part of maybe trillions of galaxies in this universe, that if we went at the speed of light, it would take 13.8 billion years to cross. The God who made all of that, stop and just try to wrap your mind around this. Becomes small, 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 small. So that he becomes this little embryo in Mary's womb that then develops just like you and I developed as babies in our mother's womb. And 9 months later it is born. Helpless, Never seen a baby full grown, born that can look after themselves. Needing human beings, imperfect as they are, as flawed as they are, to care for him, to train him up. Mighty God. God comes to us as a child. We would expect God to come to the rescue, as somebody in power that would come and destroy the enemy, that would come and make everything right by sheer power. God comes to us as a child, mighty, but a child. Everlasting Father. Speaks of the relationship that God seeks through coming to us to have with us. He doesn't come to lord it over us like the rulers of most days and rulers in our countries do too. He doesn't come to kind of tell us everything, just order us around. He comes as a father to love and care for us the way a father loves and cares for his children and his family. And I understand today, and maybe some of you have grown up in homes where there's been less than a loving father. And sometimes when we hear God as our father, we superimpose the image of our God, of our human fathers on God. And I'm saying, men, let me speak to men who are fathers particularly. We need to reverse that and say, God as our father gives us the model for what it means to be a dad. The parable of the prodigal son is really misnamed, mistitled. It is the parable of a loving father who, regardless of the offense of either one of his children, regardless of the rejection relationship by either one of his children, the one who was doing good legalistically and the one who kind of went off and lived a wild life, loves them both, invites them both, and doesn't disown them. Everlasting. That means forever. He's not a father that's going to walk out on you. He's not a father that's going to abandon you just at any moment. He's not a father that's going to say, hey, how come you missed out on this part? You did really good over there, but you could have been better. He's a father that loves us unconditionally for who we are, the way we are, right where we are. And then, of course, I want to quickly add to say he loves you too much to leave there, but that's a different message. God comes to us as an everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. I'm going to leave that one for now because next Sunday our theme is peace. The third candle we're going to light. We're going to talk about peace. I want to bring this back up and talk about peace. But today it's about faith and what God does and what he shows us through the eyes of faith. When we see Isaiah's vision, it's not a sentimental picture or vision of, a cute little baby in a manger. We have our Christmas cards that kind of sanitize the whole situation, the whole setting, and we see it that way. By the way, did you see the wild eyes in Joseph's eyes as he's born? That's reality as a dad when you see your child born. I wasn't at present my children's birth, but I was at one of my first grandson's birth, and it's wild. He doesn't play this sentimental picture of what it's like, that everything is going to be pure and innocent, because this child does not remain a baby. And when he gives these four names of who this child is and what he's going to do, he's describing what is a total attack, attack on everything that keeps us from God and everything that is wrong in the world, to begin to set it right. Not in the way that we would think he should, but the way God chooses to go about it. He describes people who simply still don't see that yet. as those who walk in darkness. The Advent season, which we're in right now. Advent means coming. And Advent season is about being prepared, to getting ready for his coming. And yes, getting ready to celebrate Christmas, I know that. But in Advent, I invite people to step back in time. To step back in time before Jesus came. And to consider what life was like then. What it was like without the Savior, without Jesus, without someone there to rescue. What was it like for people walking in darkness? And I say that because today, there are still people who are walking around in darkness because for them, Jesus has not come the first time. And Advent should be a season that reminds us of that because it's also preparing for his second coming because he said he would come again. We need to be reminded that most of us, probably all of us at one point, stumbled around in the darkness ourselves. And reminded what it was like. That we stumbled around in the darkness often of our own making. That's my experience. That at age 18, I walked away from the church. I walked away eventually from my faith. And for about 12 years, I stumbled around in the darkness of my own making. And I almost was the undoing of my life and my marriage and my Diana's life as well. But then we see that it's already given, that there's this light that has shone. And Isaiah's prophecy can easily become fulfilled in our lives as through faith we begin to see what God is doing in our lives and in the world around us. Mary and Joseph, in an act of faith and trust in God, responded to his calling and his invitation to become part of what God was doing. I believe today God invites us in the same way. And you and I may say, like, who am I? Why me? What do I have? We heard last Sunday when Brian talked about being called and feeling he wasn't qualified for anything that God was calling him to do. In fact, I would venture to say this, that if you feel qualified and you think, yeah, I can do this, you're probably thinking too small. Because wherever God calls us to get engaged with what he's doing in the world and through our lives, it will always be something that we look at it and we say, I can't do that. Because as soon as we say, I can't do that, then when we take it on, we realize that we need God's presence with us. We're not going to go out there on our own gifts and our own abilities and our own resources. How do you spell faith? Come on, you know that. Thank you. R-I-S-K. There needs to be risk involved for faith to be needed. Mary and Joseph took something on. They had no clue where this was going to take them. Most often what God invites us to take on, as big as it may seem in the moment, what God accomplishes and what it becomes even far bigger. And I believe God in his mercy never tells us that, because we would never take the first step at all if we knew where it was going to go and what it would demand of us. So today, we're reminded by Isaiah, who predicted 700 years before the birth of Jesus, that this child would be born, would be a source of hope, but to see through eyes of faith who this child is and has become, and his presence with us today. This child, who is he? Who is the baby that's in the manger that, when Christmas is over, we kind of put all the things away and put them in storage for next year? He's Jesus, God in the flesh, who lived a human life just like you and I do, so that we could become aware of and to know who God is and what he is like. That's why John says, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. The Word was God. In Jesus, we know everything that we need to know about who God is and what he's like. And by coming to us as a child, he invites us into that kind of relationship with him, because that child eventually grew up, died for us, rose again so that we might have new life in him. We're going to get ready for communion by singing a Christmas song that describes, asks the question, what child is this?